Okay, here we go. So module 31, ecological footprints. So our learning goals, we're going to explain the ecological footprint and what it tells us, and describe the carbon footprint and how it differs from the ecological footprint. So an ecological footprint is measured in the area of land and water individuals, populations, or an activity requires to produce the resources consumed and the waste generated. Okay, so we talked about we use a lot of land for agriculture, not just for our food, but sometimes for our food to eat food, right? So cows just don't eat grass most of the time; they'll eat corn or other grains, kind of fatten them up a little bit. Okay, and that takes land as well. Typically, biological reproductive land in hectares is what we say. So we don't say acres; we say hectares. It's just kind of a universal measurement for that sort of thing. And that is usually 1 hectare is 2.47 acres. An acre is about a football field, so it's about 2.5 football fields is 1 hectare. One thing you want to make sure you don't get tripped up on is it says biologically reproductive. Okay, so we're going to talk about a minute who or how much land each person should technically get. Okay, and your calculations might be a little off just because you're thinking like, oh, how much land is there on the earth? Well, it has to be biologically reproductive, okay, for it to count in this.
Is that something that can produce energy?
It has to have living things that being able to be reproduced on it. That's a good question. Okay, so ecological footprint is not an easy thing to calculate just because a lot of things are interdependent, which means they rely on each other. So like I was saying earlier, we need to feed our food, right? We have to feed our cows and our chickens and our goats, so that requires additional land. But also, you all wear clothes to school every day, thank goodness, and that requires land too, right? We need land to grow the fibers that make our clothes, or we need land to extract the energy out, or land to get the timber for our papers and our houses and our buildings, okay? Those sorts of things. All those things are interrelated on how you use them, and so it's kind of hard to calculate ecological footprint. So yeah, ecological footprint can be calculated by summing up the land required for food eaten, water use, energy use, clothing worn, housing, and transportation. People in more developed nations tend to have a larger footprint than those in developing nations. Any guesses as to why?
Well, because they have better machinery and technology and that produces higher carbon emissions.
Okay, yeah, so we have probably more manufacturing going on, right? And that requires land, and it also offsets with carbon. Okay, so I want you to turn to your partner right now, or the person at your table that you're sitting with, and explain and describe the relationship between economic level and development and ecological footprints. So how is the economic development and ecological footprint related? Ready, go.
God, get out.
All right, wrap up your thoughts. 3, 2, and 1. So if you were to look at this table, you can see that developed countries such as the United States, we use a lot of productive land per person compared to some developing nations like India. We use almost 8 times as much. And so the more developed a nation is, the more resources we use, right? Because we're not just using the clothes on our back and the food that we're eating, but we're also using things like cell phones, right? Okay, cell phones have a ton of precious metals in them: copper, silver, gold, all those things, and that requires us to go get them, which is counted for in that, right? Okay, how much water do you use a day? Probably more than you think, okay? Because you're not going to the bathroom on the ground, right? And you're also hopefully washing your hands. That requires water, okay? Energy, what?
Have you ever pooped in the ground before?
Yeah.
Deep ass hole, you guys.
Okay, but also think about this. Has anybody in here ever gone a day in their life without your air conditioning or heat? Okay, some of you have, but it's not a consistent thing, right? Okay, you go to school, it's air conditioned. You go home, it's probably air conditioned. You have a car, most of the time it's probably air conditioned. That requires energy, right? Okay, so our footprint's a lot bigger. If you divided up all the biologically productive land by the amount that each person should get, so that 8 billion people, okay, each person's fair share of the earth is 1.6 hectares. Okay, that's how much that you should be able to use based off of how much of the earth there is. We're way over that in the United States. Okay, crazy. Yes, ma'am.
Are you saying that, okay, is that saying that the other countries are developing or is it just India?
So yeah, these other countries are still in a little bit of development, and the way they're tracking that again is by population growth. So it could be a little bit skewed, but some like China, they have figured out they live in a lot closer quarters than we do. So like you typically have bigger families living in a single house, right? Instead of just like your parents and your siblings, it's like grandparents, aunts, uncles, mom, dad, and children all living in the same spot. Or they tend to scale up really well. So apartment buildings are filled with people. They're using less just naturally because that's what their culture is all about. Right? Okay, so China would still be considered probably a developed nation, but India, they're still trying to figure out healthcare and that kind of stuff in a lot of those places. Not the entire country of India, but more of a population. Okay. Good. So we're on our second standard. Describe the carbon footprint and how it differs from the ecological footprint. Okay. So carbon footprint differs from ecological footprint by being measured of total carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions released through activities, both directly and indirectly, by a person, country, or other entity. Give me something that contributes to a carbon footprint. Amani already said factories. Something else. Cars. Good. Okay. What else?
Chopping down forests.
Chopping down forests, yeah. So that increases our carbon footprint because there's nothing taking it out. What else? What about your food? Smoking, yeah. Farming, okay. So carbon footprint is talking about carbon, but it's also talking about other greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is considered in the calculation because it's the most abundant greenhouse gas, but also includes things like methane. And so one unit of methane is equal to 25 things of carbon dioxide. So that is included. And where does methane come from naturally? Cow farts, right? That's what you hear. Yeah, it comes from all kinds of agriculture, but mainly cow pig farts. That's what they. Okay. Activities such as manufacturing are taken into account when calculating carbon footprint, but are generally estimated. So how much carbon was produced when they were making your shirt or your iPhone or your backpack or your car, right? So we think cars are contributing just in the way that you drive them, but also how much energy did it take to make your car, make the parts in your car, to make your tires you have to replace, right? Okay, so calculating carbon footprints for countries includes several observations like food production and transportation. Using the U.S. as a marker, so just kind of as a jumping off point, many other countries have carbon footprints comparable to the United States. So even though China has the most CO2 production, per person, the United States is way ahead of that. So per person in China, their carbon footprint is about 10 metric tons per person for their life. In the United States, it's 17.3. Okay, and so even though China makes up half of the carbon footprint per person, the United States is way worse because we have a lower population. Okay. And then places like India, it's only about 2 metric tons per person over the course of their life. And so that's really just like food and clothing. Think about it. Okay, so this is 2 graphs about our transportation carbon footprint and our food carbon footprint. So what food makes up the most carbon footprints? Meat. Okay, so meat is something that we love to have. Tastes really good most of the time. It's high in energy, and it's delicious, right? But it does take a toll on our environment when over 50% of our diet is meat. It's producing a lot of carbon and it uses a lot of resources, right? And then, would you have guessed that medium and heavy duty trucks takes up less of our carbon footprint than passenger cars, minivans, sport utility vehicles, etc.? Yeah, I would have guessed heavy duty trucks would have been more, but there's more of the passenger cars and that kind of stuff on the road, so I guess that makes sense, right? Okay. What is a way that we could reduce our carbon footprint for transportation?
Biking, making like cities more like walkable.
Sweet, yeah. So making cities more walkable, carpooling, okay? Both of those things. Public transportation is huge, right? And then obviously the easy one to reduce our carbon footprint for food would be reduce our meat consumption. Right? Yeah. Feel it? Good. Okay, that is your module 31. The review will be posted a little bit later.